Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon. My name is Katy Cheney. I head up the food business team at Compassion in World Farming. And I'm here today with my colleague Chris G from the WSPA to introduce you to a brand new initiative that both organisations have developed in partnership, which is our business benchmark in farm animal welfare, or benchmark for short. I'm going to start the session today by giving you some background to our benchmark programme, and then I'm going to pass over to Chris, who will run through the results of our very first 2012 benchmark, which I hope everyone has in your pack as well. Okay, so what is the benchmark? Thank you, Model Buckley. In a nutshell, our programme goal is to develop a truly global benchmark of the world's leading and therefore most impactful food companies and their approach to farm animal welfare. The benchmark is jointly supported by Compassion in World Farming on the WSPA, but it is an independent entity to both organisations, governed by an external secretariat, the kind of specialist expertise that's required to engage with the responsible and the mainstream investment community. Our key aim in supporting this initiative from an NGO perspective is to engage with this influential stakeholder group in order to stimulate higher standards of farm animal welfare and therefore raising the baseline over time. Okay, so the concept of the benchmark was formed following early indications from the investment community that farm animal welfare was an emerging issue specifically for responsible investors. And this is based on their increasing awareness of legislation, particularly within the EU, and also growing consumer concern on farm animal welfare issues. Compassion commissioned some initial research back in 2009 to gauge appetite within the responsible investment community and determine whether the climate was right for engaging specifically on farm animal welfare at the moment. We were aware that the issue was often seen as a niche consideration by many in that stakeholder group, primarily because it was highly complex and not necessarily applicable to an entire investment portfolio. But we were encouraged to hear that this stakeholder group were already linking farm animal welfare with issues such as food security and supply, nutrition and health, climate change, for example. And we were also being told that the biggest barrier to investors engaging with companies on this issue was a lack of consensus on how companies should be managing and reporting on their farm animal welfare impacts. So Compassion and the WSPA already have successful corporate engagement programmes. Both Chris and I are on the corporate engagement side of both organisations. But we were particularly keen to begin a dialogue with investors because they are uniquely placed to engage with corporate management boards on areas of perceived risk, including reputational and financial risk, which are linked with corporate responsibility themes such as climate change, poverty, human rights. Traditionally, farm animal welfare has been overlooked by investors, seemingly regarded as an ethical or a moral issue rather than a business risk issue to be managed. However, attitudes are changing and have been changing for some time, and with incidents such as the recent horse meat scandal, highlighting food companies' exposure to supply chain risks that extend beyond expected compliance with quality, safety and regulatory issues. So in light of our feasibility report's findings and the potential impact this stakeholder group could generate, the benchmark has been designed to help drive higher farm animal welfare standards across the world's leading food businesses by providing an independent, impartial, reliable assessment of individual companies' efforts to adopt higher welfare standards, aimed primarily at the investment community, but also at government, academics and NGOs. The benchmark also provides practical guidance to companies interested in improving their management and particularly their reporting on farm animal welfare issues. And in this way we seek to reposition farm animal welfare firmly within the corporate social responsibility agenda of the food industry, where traditionally it's been seen as a niche or an optional consideration for all but the leaders. So despite our launching our first benchmark just recently in February, this project has actually been in development for the last 3 years approximately. and we were particularly keen to avoid pitfalls of previous initiatives of this kind. To date, there has been relatively little interaction between NGOs and investors, and where it had happened formally, there have been some common misunderstandings, particularly around where investors' primary interests lay, and therefore how to message to them in the most effective way. But also around what investors could actually do in practice, and the degree of action that could be stimulated from investor engagement alone, as opposed to then using a corporate engagement programme, for example, to follow up and plug in the gaps with some practical solutions. The animal welfare sector is not alone in this lack of effective engagement with investors as agents for change. Collaboration requires learning on both sides, on the respective drivers for change, as well as a shared understanding of what can realistically be achieved through engagement with companies. So with that in mind, the Benchmark Programme Secretariat has sought to engage with investors and with companies through a process of continual dialogue, which began formally in October 2011, where we launched the concept formally to the responsible investment community at a seminar hosted by Henderson Global Investors. We followed this event by engaging with some of the leading stakeholder bodies. We've had webinars hosted by the Principles of Responsible Investment, which attracted attention from across the globe. We had a consultation hosted by the Cooperative Asset Management on the 2012 benchmark criteria, with end users from a range of leading investment and research houses. And more recently, we launched our 2012 benchmark report at an event jointly hosted by the Cooperative Asset Management and the MSCI, and have been successful in generating a range of publicity on this issue through that initial launch. And as a result of our focus on communications to date, we have a product which has been very well received by our target stakeholder group in its first year, and the feeling that we're already a couple of years ahead of where we wanted to be at this stage. It's all very positive and cheerful, which is great. We also seek to engage remotely by developing a contact database made up primarily of subscribers to our dedicated website, so www.bb4.com, please sign up. Our website currently functions as a business card for the programme, but it also houses all of our published material to date, which we are being very transparent about, because that's what we're asking of companies. So our 2012 report is available there, as are our documents on the consultations that we've held to date, and a range of investor briefings and alerts that are sent out every 6 to 8 weeks to website subscribers. And running in parallel to that work stream, our communications work stream, we've been developing our benchmark criteria over an 18-month period with a working group made up of technical experts from Compassion, from the WSPA, but also with consultants with a range of expertise in the responsible investment field and corporate social responsibility spheres as well. The criteria, which are also available on the website with the scoring system, were informed by current thinking on good practice, on what farm animal welfare looks like, current reporting practice, both on farm animal welfare but also on wider corporate social responsibility issues in general, our understanding of investor and other stakeholder expectations of corporate responsibility reporting, the experience of our food business team at Compassion, who've been evaluating farm animal welfare performance of food companies over the last 10 years. WSPA's programme that involves engaging on farm animal welfare with food companies in Asia, Europe and Latin America. And also the stakeholder feedback that we've gained through ongoing dialogue and also through our consultation process in June and July last year. So the results of this work stream is a series of 17 questions in 3 categories, addressing how companies communicate their management commitment and policy, their governance and management, and research and innovation in relation to their animal welfare impact specifically. Reflecting the relative immaturity of farm animal welfare as a business issue, the criteria have been developed around the basic premise that companies who are serious about farm animal welfare should provide evidence of their commitments within the context of defined standards, with a description of how they implement these standards and manage performance throughout their supply chains. This is not only in line with the ways companies manage other CSR issues, but also how investors review company approaches to the management of business risks. Therefore, the focus of the criteria in year one, and probably in the next 2 or 3 years, is going to be on policy management and processes rather than performance outcomes at this stage only. This is deliberate and modelled on examples set by previous CSR issue-related benchmarks, on the basis that while a company can publish policy commitments without acting on them, there is no way you can effectively measure performance without adequate policy framework in place. Our intention over time is to move to a more performance-based approach to benchmarking food companies though. So our initial universe of companies for the 2012 benchmark, we have 68 companies which represent the 3 primary food business sectors: food producers, including processing manufacturers, food retailers and food service companies. Again, in line with best practice, we've included primarily listed companies, but also a selection of non-listed companies by way of drawing comparison. Our primary criterion for selecting companies was the scale of their operations in the EU, given that farm animal welfare regulation and public awareness are much higher in Europe relative to other regions. We wanted in the first instance to focus on food companies that were more likely to have developed and implemented effective farm animal welfare systems, so that we could identify examples of leadership and best practice. So I want to hand you over to my colleague Chris G from the WSPA, who's going to talk you through the 2012 results in more detail.
Thanks, Katie. And so you see on here, on this slide here, we've got companies based, the largest food business companies in Europe. You see there's 14 American companies there, and that's based on the scale of their operations in Europe. The companies were evaluated based on their global policies. For us and for Compassion, it's really important to be thinking at a global level, because most of the large companies who have the impact on the largest amount of animals are global. And so Dr. Dan asked us to very much focus this on how this interacts and intersects with public policy, what the implications of the benchmark could be for policy, and vice versa. So we've got a selection of detailed findings here, and relatively few companies report on their commitments, or with their regards to the complete avoidance of close confinement, and you see here about 47% made some kind of partial commitment in relation to cage-free or free-range hens, phasing out sow stalls, and this also leads from organic or free-range systems. It's important to say that when we were assessing these companies, it was based on their publicly available material. So it had to be on their website or in their CSR report for it to count. Now, why did we do that? Because we're looking at this through the prism of an investor. And if an investor wants to invest in a company, that's where they'll look to check how the company are managing risks. And so all the way through this, we're thinking about this, of how would an investor think about this? And there's a reason for this. And one of the problems we've got in the world is a company like McDonald's will say, okay, well, we will go use free-range eggs, I'll be cage-free here in Europe, but in our global operations, that won't be the case. Whereas an investor, if he chooses to invest in McDonald's, will be investing in McDonald's as a global entity, not just what it's doing in Europe. So for us as animal welfare campaigners, has a significant advantage of looking through the prism of the investor. And you see on here, when we spoke earlier about the hens directive, and it does seem to be the case that companies who are reporting on this are doing so because there's legislation, I guess from what we heard earlier, labelling in place. It's quite early for us to be drawing conclusions because this is our first benchmark, but we're just trying to give you a feel for what we've seen. So out of the 68 companies, only 12 have published positions on the use of growth promoting substances. And so that's something that we'll hope to see progress on as this progresses. And those that did say anything about their policies referred to compliance with EU legislation. So again, it's kind of seeing that companies are choosing to talk about this and say they're doing something about it because there's legislation in place. However, that wasn't always the case. So, for example, on the avoidance of GM or cloned animals, That's something where clearly there isn't legislation in place, and the principal driver is consumer attitudes as we stand today. And companies did say, as we interacted with them through the benchmark, that this is something where they have a policy, and it's primarily there because of consumer attitudes. If those attitudes changed, their policy might change. So I think there's thinking about how it interacts with policy right now. This first benchmark provides a baseline and some ability to think about this and be able to think into the future. As future editions of the benchmark come out, we'll be able to see how this changes over time. We had a look here at the various, have a look here at the subsectors between food producers, restaurants and bars, food retailers, and you'll see the blue line, which is the average overall score. The key finding from here is that the restaurants and bars at the moment seem to be laggards in terms of speaking about their commitments on animal welfare and policy. Clearly, companies like McDonald's have been in the media spotlight on this issue, but we're kind of guessing, it's very early to be drawing conclusions, we're guessing they've been under less consumer pressure up till now to be being clear with their consumers as to what their policies are. 18 of the companies are within the 60-80 UK, so it's the only one that had anywhere near a large enough sample size to be able to be looking at the UK versus the overall average. But seeing as we're here in the UK today, the good news is the UK is performing better, but we can't really say that with just 18 companies at this stage as a key finding. We'll be getting to the list very soon, the exciting bit of this, where you get to see where different companies are on the scale. But for now, I'm going to leave you hanging and think, well, 71% of companies acknowledge farm animal welfare as a business issue. We used a very, very loose definition here. These are food business companies interacting with animals all the time, and 29% of them said nothing in their CSR reports, nothing on their websites about how they're handling or how they're managing animal welfare. So that's something we hope through this process. Some of them will receive some challenge on their need to be showing how they've got policy in place. From that 71%, only 46% are formal farm animal welfare policy. Most of them were pretty limited in their scope, relatively unclear about their positions on key welfare concerns, and that problem again, limited in scope, e.g. just in the UK or just in Europe we commit to this. 41% describe how their board or senior management oversee their approach to farm animal welfare, and just 26% have published objectives and targets of farm animal welfare. Now we see this is an opportunity. It's clearly, for us, we all think this is a problem. There's actually a massive opportunity. There are companies out there doing this. There is best practice, and we're hoping to use the benchmark to bring out that best practice and inspire other companies to follow suit of those who are leaders at the moment. And reporting on farm animal welfare is the exception rather than the rule, and there are few examples of how companies are contributing to the wider debate about farm animal welfare. So here's the exciting bit. You get to see how your favourite brand or owners are doing throughout the tiers. We put them in tiers. You'll see that nobody made tier 1 in year 1, so there's always room for improvement even amongst those who are already talking about their farm animal welfare policies. 62% of companies are in this tiers 5 and 6, which is no acknowledgement of the issue, or where they have said something about animal welfare. There's really limited information or nothing that anyone could hold them to account to on what they're saying. So we're hoping those companies move up. Companies in tiers 3 to 6, there's a distinction between their reporting and practice. And you'll see some companies you might expect to see scoring better. Waitrose there in tier 4, where they might actually be doing some pretty good work, and they are actually doing some pretty good work on animal welfare, but it's not available. And it not being available is a problem to us, because that means that other companies can't see how to use that best practice. And so some companies do feel, and Marks & Spencer were at our launch, and they said they were disappointed with their score, but immediately said they'll be putting in place procedures to be talking more about, in their reports, about how they're tackling farm animal welfare concerns. And you'll see some controversial companies scoring fairly well. Take Smithfield's Foods, who've been implicated in quite a few scandals, particularly in the US, on animal welfare. There's somebody who, they have been hit quite hard by animal rights and animal welfare groups in the past. and interestingly, their response has been to put in place policy. That doesn't mean that right now they've got in place the practice, and our benchmark is very much at this stage looking at policy. We're looking to smoke out that policy, smoke out those commitments and policy commitments, and that then will enable us to be thinking about how we're then moving, getting to those outcomes that we all want to see for animals. And those in tier 2 and 3, I see Noble Foods, the good egg company I think was mentioned earlier today. Noble Foods do have good, relatively speaking, good policies up on how they are managing farm animal welfare. And what we've been doing, and that report that's in your packs, we've been highlighting the best practice of how companies are talking about the work they're doing, so that people can copy what is the best practice. So, as Katy sort of spoke about originally, the normative framework for managing and reporting on farm animal welfare. So companies are just confused with the differences in different countries and different regions as to what's expected of them. And what they want is an easy life. We all want an easy life. They want a framework that you can interact with. And when you think about the largest global companies, they struggle a little bit with things that are just British or just European, because they've got global supply chains. And so what we're hoping to do through this is put in place a framework that companies and investors can engage in. Up to now, investors have considered animal welfare more of an ethical issue rather than a business risk. What we've been trying to do is say, well, hey, it is a business risk because there are countries not complying with EU directives, and so you are probably in your supply chain sourcing from countries that are not compliant with the law. Therefore, any sensible investor will be saying, well, if this company isn't managing this well, how can we trust them in terms of our investments on this or on any other issue? So it's giving us a chance to get investors engaged and asking the questions, and there's a real benefit of having investors engaged, because when we as animal welfarists go and speak to companies, we get put with the agriculture person or the corporate social responsibility person, and generally they're not the most powerful person in a company. The most powerful person in the company is the CEO, the finance director, the board of directors. When investors ring up companies, they get to speak to those people, and they say this is a concern. Then those directors turn to their corporate social responsibility director or their agriculture director and say, I want this sorted. And the person goes, oh, I've been wanting to do this for ages, but I'm just really worried that if I asked them to change, it would cost loads of money, and I've got all these issues I want to be dealing with. So I think what we're trying to do is create an environment where change becomes far more likely. We're saying that leadership on farm animal welfare in the UK and Europe is being driven by legislation. Companies are saying the reason we're doing this is there's legislation in place, and the reason we have those policies is because legislation is in place. And we think that the supply chains that are just thinking about safety, quality, or regulatory compliance don't go far enough. So that's all from us today. The Benchmark website, I encourage you to go there, sign up, there's regular updates there. Any questions?
Thank you very much.